because we want to make sure that when you are in the midst of these buyer negotiations, you have as many tools in your tool belt as is necessary so that your buyer wins. So we started out talking about purchase price. There are various strategies. I will not exhaust that because we already went through it in the previous trainings. And, we talked about whether or not we're using escalation clauses versus, just a simple offer with your buyer's highest and best. And that depends on how competitive the situation is. Because if you talk to an agent and there are no offers, your buyer strategy is going to be different than if you talk to the listing agent and there are 5 offers on the table. So let's talk in terms of purchase price. That's the very first thing as it pertains to the buyer's negotiation. It's a very obvious thing, but there are various strategies that you can use to be able to negotiate that purchase price in a way that it works well for your buyers. All right, we're going to keep moving forward. If anybody has any questions or anything that they'd like to include there, come off of mute. Otherwise, I'm not going to go back through all the details of the slides that we've already covered. All right. Second, we talked about seller concessions. And this is very important as it pertains to seller concessions because with respect to the buyer's loan, the lender will only allow the buyer to receive a certain percentage. So you've got to ask that lender what that is in advance. That may be a total of 6% in total seller concession for the transaction. And if you negotiate anything above that, then the buyer is not able to do anything with that. So you need to know exactly what that is that you're asking for. But even more so, you need to ask the lender what the buyer needs in advance, right? So you're going to be explaining to the buyer that you're only asking for what they absolutely need in a competitive situation. Because like we said before, the whole goal is to get the buyer the property. And that's why the buyer hires the Porterhouse Realty Pro, so that you can get them to their expected end. So if you have a buyer, you know that they only need $5,000 in closing costs, and they have a lot of other liquid assets. You may not ask for $50,000 in closing costs and cause them to not win the bid because we wanted to be extra aggressive in something that they didn't really need, okay? So that's a conversation that you have with the lender in advance, and you're strategic in what it is that you're asking for. And you can just maximize whatever those advantages are, because as it pertains to those seller concessions, there's some things that can be applied to an interest rate buy down. And we did not talk about that. So I'm going to go ahead and elaborate on that for a moment, because as an example, if maybe your buyer's purchasing a property that's, $400,000, and maybe that buyer needs $10,000 from the lender, right? But if the buyer needs a rate buy down, then instead of asking for $10,000 or $20,000 towards closing costs, if by chance the seller was willing to offer that, maybe 10,000 of it goes towards their closing costs and the other 10 goes towards a rate buy down. So it's the same 20,000 that the buyer would have been asking for, but you're strategically asking for an interest rate buy down so that now the buyer can afford the property. And if anybody has any questions, you can take yourself off of mute, because I want to make sure that that makes sense. And if it's your first time hearing about it, I know we talked about it during our month of Lender Palooza and we mentioned it before, but I definitely want to make sure that you understand what we mean. And I'll elaborate just briefly. If by chance the interest rate is 6.5%, and that puts the buyer's mortgage at a rate, I don't know, depending on the property that they're purchasing, maybe they're, paying $3,500 a month, right? Or $4,000 a month. But if you buy that interest rate down by maybe a half a point, maybe it won't be $4,000 a month. It'll only be $3,500 a month, so that the buyer's able to afford the property at the same price, but the interest rate is lower. So then their payment monthly is going to be lower. So that is the purpose of an interest rate buy down. Okay. So the numbers that I gave, they're not from a lender. Those are just throwing numbers out there for the sake of us understanding the concept, so we know why the strategy is effective, because some buyers may not need all of the closing cost help, but it would benefit them to have a lower interest rate. And that's one of the type of seller concessions that you can ask for. Okay. Does anybody have any questions or any comments about that? If so, go ahead and unmute yourself and let's talk about it.
Does the lender have to determine if they can buy it down? Or is that something we should be asking um, the lender before even suggesting that or requesting that?
So great question. And I have not met a lender or a program that doesn't allow the buyer to buy down the rate, right? But it is always a good question to ask the lender with the buyer paying towards the interest rate. You know how with some lenders they charge points and other lenders don't charge points, and you can see maybe one is charging points and they have a lower interest rate, and the one is not charging points, they have a higher interest rate. It really depends on how the lender has structured their financing for the buyer, but it's almost always a possibility for the buyer to buy down that interest rate. And it's simply the buyer just putting money towards specifically the interest rate versus it going into the two pots that we tell the buyer, either your down payment or your closing costs. So that is very intentional so that the buyer is able to get into that property with less of a monthly payment, right? So it's not the same as reducing their closing costs, but it's going to reduce their monthly payment in them getting that concession for the seller or from the seller. Okay. Great question, Aurelia. Anybody else? All right, then we're going to continue because we talked about the seller concession, but I just wanted to add one component that we did not talk about. And in terms of home inspections and negotiations, we talked about all of these things. But one of the things that I want to point out here in this brief recap is as it pertains to the home inspection negotiations, we're going to go through that addendum so we know exactly what that reads afresh, because obviously we use it and sometimes, we read through it, but I think it's time for us to lay eyes on it and read through each of those paragraphs so you know exactly how to utilize that home inspection contingency. Because what it does is it gives the buyer the ability to negotiate, right? And what we're negotiating, we're not negotiating things that are, just for visual enhancement or things that, are just cosmetic. We're negotiating things that are defects. We're negotiating things that are actual repair issues, not cosmetic concerns, right? So we want to make sure that we're prioritizing the request in that. But the question becomes whether we're asking for repairs or whether we're asking for credits, because the two are different. Either a repair credit or the repair. And remember, we just talked about those seller concessions. The lender will have stipulations as to how much a repair credit the buyer can receive, because all of those go up under the seller concessions. So I want us to be aware that when we're asking for those credits, there's a certain percentage that you've got to talk to the lender, and it's going to be based on that buyer's loan type that buyer can receive. So be aware of what you're asking for so that you're sure that the buyer's able to utilize all of that money for the transaction. And I had a very great conversation with one of our Realty pros yesterday. And, we had a similar conversation before, and she negotiated aggressively in terms of repair credits for the buyer and other seller concessions. And she was in a position where the buyer now had an excess of $1,600 that they could not use. Right? Not that the seller didn't give it, but it was in the contract for the buyer to receive it, but they had exceeded the allowable amount that the lender would allow them to receive. So her question was, what can I do with this? We don't want the buyer to lose it. The lender said it's nothing else that they can do with these funds. So how do we manage it so that the buyer does not lose it? So let me ask you guys, in that situation, what would you do if there's an excess of some money that cannot be used towards the buyer's credits or seller concession, because now the buyer has maxed out what the lender will allow them to receive from the seller? What would you guys do with that money? And how can you structure it in the transaction so that it benefits and it's not lost? I'm going to play my Jeopardy music. Just give me your best answer. Come off of mute and just tell me some things that you think your best ideas.
I mean, can it go towards the brokerage commission?
Ding, ding, ding. I like your answer. Donisha said towards the broker's commission. Anybody else? Any other takers on that? What do you guys think? Come on, give me one more person at least. All right, let's see who we call on. Let's see. Aurelia, what do you think?
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so when you say seller concessions, that's including closing costs and that kind of stuff, right?
Yes, total seller concessions.
Okay, so we have that covered. The brokers, can you reduce the price of the sale by
You
that amount?
can. Yes, you can.
Okay,
You can reduce the price of the property by that amount.
I mean, that puts something in the buyer's pocket. Um, so it can't go towards the concession. You said it can't, the concessions are the closing. And you
Mhm.
said something about something else for the buyer. I'm trying to figure out what else also benefit the buyer. But that's the only thing I can think of
Good
is
job. So
reducing the
we have
price. Hmm.
excellent. So we have two. We have one from Danisha that said towards the buyer brokerage fee, and one from Aurelia that says reduce the price of the home. Both of those are great answers. Can anybody else think of another answer?
The concessions can also help with the down payment.
Can definitely help with the down payment. Now, Miss Pat, what else was it that you were going to say?
I was wondering about HOA costs or the like that you might pay that off, or if it's um ground rent or something, perhaps pay that off, something like that.
Excellent. So excellent for all of those. And in instances where the buyer has not exceeded the maximum allowable seller concessions, they can definitely pay down the ground rent. They can definitely pay down the HOA and all of those things. Now, when they've gotten to a point where they've maximized it, say by chance, they're only allowed 6% back and they've gotten, 6.5% or 7% back. Now they're not able to apply those to any of those areas under concessions. Now they would need to do one of the two things, either what Aurelia said in terms of reducing the purchase price of the home by that $1,600, or what Danisha said in terms of adding that as, additional commission to the buyer broker, right? And what would benefit, reducing the sales price by $1,600 is probably going to reduce the payment by a penny, if that, right? So it's really not going to be a benefit to the buyer. And even having the buyer to, is not going to reduce what it is that they have in terms of cash out of pocket by probably a penny, if that. So the best option there is going to be to have that to be buyer broker compensation. So then let me ask you guys this question. If now you have a buyer broker agreement, like Mr. Porter and I were 3.5%, you guys might be 3% at plus the 795, but you want to include an additional $1,600, what do you have to do to make that valid?
I know there's an addendum. I don't think it's the change addendum unless you do the other. I feel like there's a specific addendum for especially now after the whole NAR thing, for the broker compensation.
Okay. Can
So,
anybody add to that?
well, I actually have a question about that because
Sure.
if you have the seller already agreeing to pay the entire commission, which we know that may not be possible, well, what if it is? Um, how does that work? Maybe you can answer that afterwards, but I would just want to know how can you add that in if the seller is already covering all of the commission?
Outstanding question, Aurelia. Anybody else? Anybody have any thoughts or contributions to that? All right. So a hint is what Donisha was saying when she was talking about the addendum, that there has to be some type of addendum that's included in the agreement. And she's absolutely right. So there are two things that have to happen. Number one, within the contract, there needs to be a change in terms so that now that $1,600 or whatever that amount is, it would be great if it's $5,000, $10,000, whatever it is. So now you've got to have language in the contract in that change in terms that says this amount that was previously offered as seller concession to the buyer is now being credited to the buyer broker as additional commission, right? Or additional compensation, additional, broker compensation, right? And that's one part of it, but it has to be two part. Because remember, based on the NAR settlement, you can no longer receive commission above that which is in your buyer agency agreement. So now what must you do in order to validate that additional commission? Play my Jeopardy music. I'll ask that question one more time. You cannot receive anything above that which is on your buyer broker agreement. So now what must you do with that buyer broker agreement in order to validate receiving this additional compensation?
You gotta
Is
amend the agreement.
Ding, ding, ding. You got it, Miss Pat. So
Mm.
now you've got to go back to your buyer broker agreement and where you may have had your 3% or 3.5% plus the 795. Now you need to go and add plus $1,600, right? You must add that, and that is an agreement between the brokerage and the buyer. The seller does not need to sign off on that, okay? So you add that so that now your agreement is in line with what's in the contract and what the seller is going to pay out of what would have been those concessions there, okay? So as long as you have those two things in tandem, the addendum, that's the contract between the buyer and the seller, and then the amended agreement that's between the buyer and the brokerage, guess what? Now you get to receive additional commission. Great job there.
wonderful. I
So
had one question. Oh, I'm sorry.
go ahead.
Now, what addendum do you use then? Do you use the general or do you use the change in terms? Because you are changing the agreement itself, right? The terms that were in the agreement. What addendum do you use?
Got it. So for the one between the buyer and the brokerage, you're going literally to your buyer agency agreement, okay? And you're going to go to that agreement, and where you had 3% plus the 795, you're going to also add plus the $1,600 buyer, broker compensation there. You're going to literally add it on that document. You'll initial off on it, or myself, and have the buyer to initial off on it. That way it will be receivable. Okay. And then last but not least, if you want to tidy it up in a bow, that addendum that we ask the seller how much compensation they're going to send to the buyer's broker, you can go back there and add it to there. So we know that the listing broker on that addendum, the listing broker agreed to pay maybe 2.5%, right? And now the seller has agreed to pay 1,600 for a total of whatever this amount is. And then you have everything neatly tied up in the bow, and you can receive as much compensation as you and the buyer agree to, because there is no maximum of compensation you can receive. It just has to be a part of the agreement. Okay. So great, great question. Great contributions there. I'm glad you guys, the wheels are turning. Did anybody have any questions as it pertains to that?
So using your example with the 1,600, is that applied to the 795, or what does that look like?
So it would be an addition, because your original broker agreement is already going to have at least 3% plus 795. But
Mhm.
now there's extra money on the table that's outside of the 3% and 795. So now it's going to be plus that 1,600, which is the money that needs to be utilized within a transaction so that it's not lost.
Okay.
Okay. Because the
And the only
seller has
reason,
already agreed to pay it on behalf of the buyer. The buyer just can't do anything else with it.
gotcha. The only reason why I'm like thinking from the buyer's perspective is if I see this and I'm like, oh, okay, well, there's 1,600. Can I use that towards that 795?
Mhm. So you can definitely use it towards the 795 if that's what you want to do. Now,
Mhm.
with that being said, that 1,600 can cover the 795, or the 1,600 can be in addition to the 795. You can make that determination. As long as you add that 1,600 to the agreement, then everything is it's where it needs to be. The
Got it.
biggest thing is to make sure that everything is fully discussed and disclosed, and it's agreed to, and everybody signs off on it, and it's part of the contract.
So this is yeah, I do have an additional question to that because that was my thoughts as well. But the 1,600, how is it applied to the buyer agent, or is it and included in the compensation, or is it just a brokerage type of agreement and it just goes whatever's left? Like you say, you can use it for the 795 if it haven't already been paid. And then where does the remaining amount go? Is that a brokerage thing, or does it go to the buyer agent?
So the majority of that's going to go to the buyer's agent. And to speak to both your question and to wrap Darnisha's up in the bow, let's say as an example that the seller initially agreed to pay 2.5%, right? So that left 0.5% plus 795 for the buyer to pay. Now that there's that additional $1,600 on the table, depending on how much that 0.5% plus 795 would have equated to, it could now cover the total buyer agent compensation such that the buyer does not have to cover any of it, right? So it depends on how you negotiated that contract. So now all of it's paid by the seller, none of it's paid by the buyer with that 1,600, right? Now, if by chance it doesn't cover the difference, because, if they're purchasing a property that is 500,000, and you have a 0.5% of that, that's $2,500. So that's not going to cover that whole 0.5%. Then it'll be added to whatever it is, so that whatever the buyer owes is deducted from that. And whatever is left over goes as compensation to the buyer's agent. And that was a mouthful. So if you have any questions about it, let me know.
And then you let the title company know what you're doing.
Absolutely. And that is so key because all of the contract documents are to be sent to the title company anyway. You guys, I hope you guys know, and you've noticed the update in brokerment that, started off a few months back. Every agreement that we send over to the lender and the title company must include a copy of our buyer agency agreement, so that every lender we're working with and every title company that we're working with, they know exactly what that buyer's financial responsibilities are to the brokerage at the time of contract. So it's not we're sending them an email just to inform them that they need to add whatever the additional compensation is, but they have it so that it goes through their underwriting and it's added to their loan estimates, so that the buyer has full disclosure, not only from the brokerage, but also from the lender as to what that financial obligation the buyer has with the brokerage upfront. Okay. Any questions about that? All right. And all of this came out of home inspection negotiations and credits and stuff. Can you imagine? So credits and all that good stuff. And when we have a chance, we will go through that addendum. So we're going to have to push that maybe to another training, but I want us to be able to get through some of these. And we discussed the appraisal gap negotiations. We discussed that there are instances in which if it's a hot seller's market and maybe there are 5 offers, 10 offers on the table, and if your buyer, maybe the comparative market analysis says it'll go between 500,000 and 510,000. And the buyer say, okay, well, I'll offer 515 because I want to make sure that I get in the door. In those instances, the buyer has to do one of two things. If that buyer's with FHA, then the FHA amendatory clause in that addendum, it's going to protect the buyer. It's going to say, hey, that property has to appraise for 515,000 in order for that buyer to be committed to paying that amount, right? So the seller and the listing agent are going to look at that language and say, if you're offering 515, we want to make sure the seller can receive that, right? So that it's not just something that makes me feel good about myself, but it's something that you can actually follow through with. So in those instances, the listing agent is going to say, hey, I hear you with that great offer at 515, but let me get an appraisal gap addendum to make sure that if it doesn't appraise at 515, your buyer's actually willing to pay the amount that they offered. Okay. So those are the two competing ends of the spectrum, either the amendatory clause that protects them or the appraisal gap contingency that says they're willing to pay above the appraised amount by whatever amount they specify. And with that, there is no right or wrong answer. It's simply based on negotiations between the buyer and the seller. And what that looks like, a buyer might say, okay, well, I'm offering $515,000, but if it doesn't appraise at $515,000, then I'm willing to pay $1,500 above, whatever the appraised value is, right? If it appraises less than that. I hope that makes sense. Come off of mute, ask questions. Let's make sure that everybody comprehends their strategy there.
Yes, that makes sense.
Okay, perfect.
I just had a question about that as well.
Uh-huh.
Is it the listing agent, say for instance, you do send that over, you send that over and you don't specify that you're willing to pay above that, which means that the FHA covers you to say if it doesn't, then you can walk away from it. Is it then the listing agent I think that's what you said. Is it the listing agent's responsibility to cover themselves to say, hey, well, to put that clause in it and send it over to the buyer agent?
Absolutely. I'm looking for my reaction so I can give a round of applause. I don't see my reactions up here. Somebody put a round of applause in there because that was a great question from Aurelia. And let's make sure that we are clear. When we're on the buyer side, we're utilizing the FHA amendatory clause or the VA amendatory clause or whatever the financing type is for the buyer that says, hey, the property has to appraise at this amount in order for my buyer to be committed to paying this amount. That is what our role is when we represent the buyer. Okay. Now, with that being said, in competitive instances, the seller or the listing agent might come back and say, hey, I hear you, Miss Pat Lancaster. You're offering 515, but we need to guarantee that you're going to come to the table with what you're saying. And in those instances, to your question, Aurelia, yes, it is their responsibility to say, I need you to sign off on this appraisal gap addendum. Because what we're sending the financing addendum that has the protective language for our buyer. We're not, proactively sending over the appraisal gap addendum in most instances. I say in most instances because there have been some in very hot competitive markets where, 15, 20 offers on the property and the buyer's like, I've got to pay it and I'm willing to pay $5,000 over asking. In those instances, then the buyer is willing to do that. But in most instances, our role is going to be protective to make sure that the buyer is not paying anything more than what the property appraises for. Okay. Does everybody get that? All right. So what this slide just identified, we are negotiating this up front. So there are no surprises. We're not waiting until the property appraises to say, okay, how much the buyer's willing to pay or how much they're not willing to pay. There can be no surprises. So we're discussing the buyer cash reserves before we even make the offer. If the buyer's looking to offer over whatever the list price is in order to get that property, we're making sure that they have those cash reserves and they can fulfill the offer that they're making to the seller. We're not going to allow them to make an offer that they cannot actually follow through with, right? Because if the appraisal comes in low and we have one of those amendatory clauses that protect the buyer against paying above the appraised value, then we have the opportunity to go back and negotiate a price reduction from the seller, right? We can negotiate a credit from the seller, right? We can cause the buyer and the seller to split the difference. Or if there's an issue and it appraises at a value that the buyer feels is just completely opposite of what the market is saying, then the buyer could contest or challenge the appraisal. But in most instances, we don't have our buyer to challenge the appraisal. That's something that happens on the listing side. So that is not normally part of the buyer's conversation there, okay? But I just wanted to just go back through the appraisal gap negotiations and when we would use those and how it would benefit our buyers. All right. Any questions on that before we move on to the next slide? All right, keep it moving. Now, we talked about this in terms of settlement date. That's obvious, right? We already know that the settlement date is an important negotiation strategy. So we're asking the listing agent up front, what's ideal for your seller? What does your seller need? So that we can make sure that we align our contract with the seller's needs, right? And then the flexibility, because in some instances, you have a seller that we think that going in with a 21 to 30-day settlement is a benefit, but maybe this seller actually needs 45 to 60 days, or maybe this seller is willing to do a rent back, or maybe this seller is both selling a home and purchasing another home at the same time. So now they have a contingency where they are, purchasing and selling at the same time. So they need a little bit more flexibility on that date. These questions are imperative to make sure that the buyer's offers are as competitive as we think they are when we're offering our buyers highest and best. So you're asking this of the listing agent in advance so you know how to structure this settlement date so that it's a win-win for both the buyer and the seller. Okay? And that takes us right into rent back agreements. Something very, very important. If by chance you're in a situation where the buyer or the seller needs a rent back agreement, this is something that must be negotiated with the offer. Somebody type in the chat, negotiate with the offer. Rent back agreements have to be negotiated up front because the buyer has to know right offhand when they're able to move into the property. The seller has to know right offhand when they need to be out of that property. Because those are terms of negotiation that are crucial for both parties, because they're going to mobilize a whole home and move in potentially from a different locale or whatever the case is. They're paying for movers and all these things. They need to know that date. It's very crucial, right? So if that is the case, we present this rent back agreement, or it's going to say a post-settlement occupancy agreement, and we define what the duration is going to be. We define what the security deposit is going to be. We define, if the utilities are going to remain in the seller's name, if they're going to go in the buyer's name, and obviously they need to go in the buyer's name. But if there's a generous seller and they want to keep it until, the buyer, until they transition properties, then that's fine. But the daily occupancy fee, when you're doing a post-settlement occupancy agreement, there's a daily occupancy fee. So it may be $3,500 a month, but you're also going to have a per diem in the event that, say by chance, the seller needs 45 days of rent back, or they need 62 days of rent back. You got to determine what that daily occupancy fee is going to be. And that's something that is negotiated up front. Okay. Duration, the deposit. The deposit is something that obviously is just there in the event that when the seller moves out, they've already gone to settlement, but maybe their moving person, maybe they start bumping walls and putting scuffs in stuff that wasn't there when the buyer saw the property. That's what that security deposit is for, so that in the event that there are any type of damages or something that was not there when the buyer settled on the property, now the buyer's able to be made whole. Okay, so there's no set amount, but this is something that has to be negotiated between the buyer and the seller. Somebody say up front. All right, there we go. Does anybody have any questions as it pertains to that rent back agreement,
I do.
or it's called the post settlement occupancy agreement?
I understand the concept, but so the insurance part, I guess keeping the buyer protected, right? Because you're not seeing everything because the seller still has things in the, let's say the seller still has a lot of their um furniture, is in the home. So when the buyer walked through, they think it looks a certain way, right? Now the furniture is out in the home looks different. So when we're looking at the security deposit, you have dents that you didn't see because the furniture was covering it. How are we protecting the buyer? I mean, I guess you still wouldn't. I don't know. I'm focused on protecting the buyer because they think they are purchasing it one way, but the seller is in there longer than expected. What do we do?
Absolutely, absolutely. So great question, right? So first, I will say that the insurance aspect is something that's already going to be in place, because when the buyer goes to settlement, the lender requires, right, the pity, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, that payment is already going to be secured. So they already are going to have the homeowner's insurance on the property. The security deposit needs to be such that it's able to make whatever those repairs are. So maybe the seller goes to settlement, the property was 550,000, and the buyer says, okay, you want to be in the property for another 30 days. I need a $5,000 security deposit held with the title company until you turn that property over in good condition, right? So then in order for the buyer and the seller to sign off on the title company releasing that security deposit, what's the form that has to be turned in, guys? So when the buyer goes to the property, they walk through. Once the seller has moved out, they check off on what is right and what needs to be corrected. They sign off on it and send it over. What's that form? Play my Jeopardy music. So it's going to be the walkthrough addendum, guys. So the
Okay.
buyer has to do, I heard somebody taking yourself off mute. Maybe I moved too quickly for you. Forgive me if I did. I want to keep us moving forward there. But there is a walkthrough addendum. So the seller doesn't just get their money back. The buyer doesn't just, give the money back and the seller turns over the keys. What has to happen is there's a final walkthrough inspection in which the buyer and their agent, they come and walk through the property after the seller has now, they've moved out and now they're ready to give the keys back over to Danisha's buyer because, okay, now they've moved out. So now Danisha's going to come to the property with her buyer. She has that walkthrough addendum where she's going to go through the property and take notes, and everything that was in its proper place when they went to settlement needs to be verified as such in order for that deposit to be released. And if there, items of concern that, oh, well, this is a problem. This wasn't that way at first. This was not a part of the agreement. Then now Danisha is putting that on that walkthrough agreement and giving the seller the opportunity to make it right. And you also specify what the deadline is. So it may be, okay, I need you to repair this, correct this within 3 days. And you put that date on there. And the seller has the ability to sign off and say, okay, well, this is what the problem is. I need to correct it in this amount of days in order for the buyer to come back and verify that everything is fine. Because in this instance, what you're doing is you're keeping the carrot before the horse. In that your security deposit needs to be one that is sizable enough to make the seller jump through the necessary hoops because they want to get their money back, okay? So what does that mean? That means that if you have a property that's $550,000, you're not going to keep a $500 deposit because the seller will walk away and say, well, what's the big deal? I just got, $400,000 at the sale of the property. I've already closed on it. I got money. You keep the $500 and you do the work yourself. But if you keep something sizable like a $5,000 security deposit in escrow, now whatever is necessary in order for the seller to get their money back, they're going to do those things. They're going to take those corrective actions so that the buyer gets the property in the condition that they're supposed to get that property. So, great question to you, Danisha. And once the two parties sign off on that addendum, then and only then does the title company release the money back to the seller. So it's like a final escrow release. It is a final escrow release after settlement. The title company's holding the escrow, right? Both parties agree. Then they turn it into the title company. Then the title company says, okay, Mr. or Mrs. Seller or whomever, Danisha's buyer has signed off. You've signed off. You fulfilled your obligations. Now you can get your $5,000. And if they do not fulfill those obligations, then that $5,000 goes to Danisha's buyer. Okay. So great question there. I hope that answered it. Does anybody else have any questions or comments as it pertains to that?
So 2 questions. Ms. Pat, did you have a question or comment?
No, I'm good.
Okay, I saw your lip moving. I thought maybe I jumped the gun. So 2 questions. Are we doing 2 walkthroughs then? One before settlement and then another one once they, finish the buyback part, rent back. And then the second question in the insurance, I guess the title company is making sure that in the homeowner's insurance, there is a clause for the rent back. So that if worst case scenario, the seller burns down the house.
So great question for that. Now, what we did, so the first answer is yes. So yes for the first answer, okay? The second answer is because we've agreed to this post-settlement occupancy in advance, we've included this as part of the contract. So the lender has this in the contract. The title company has this in the contract. And whatever provisions are necessary to protect title, it's the title company's responsibility to make sure that they do it. We're not advising them as to what riders to include because that's not our lane. The title company takes care of that. The lender takes care of that, right? And then the insurance aspect is already something that will have been established, and it's something that's going to take effect on behalf of our buyer from the date of settlement. Because that buyer, they would have paid their closing costs. It's going to include some escrows and upfront for the principal, the interest, the taxes, and insurance, and those things have already been paid so that the buyer will be covered. But as it pertains to specific riders, that's the title company's responsibility to determine what is necessary and what's not necessary. So between the lender, the title company, and everybody in that. Nevertheless, this is not a rental property where it's a long-term rental, so some things are not going to be applicable. Our buyer doesn't have to get certain type of provisions because this is something that's going to be short-term. If it's anything over 6 months, then there's certain things that the buyer would have to do and certain changes they would have to make. But if it's something so short, there are things that are not going to be applicable, so they won't impact them in the same way. All right. Great question.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else? All right, let's continue. EMDs, earnest money deposit. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about this for a moment because obviously the EMD is a very important point of negotiation because it tells the seller exactly how serious the buyer is, right? We know that EMDs are not required by law, but we do at least 1% because we show our seller this buyer is serious. And essentially what it is it's the buyer's skin in the game. It's also the first part of that buyer's down payment once they do go to settlement. So if you're in a situation and you need to negotiate, if you need to increase that EMD so that it helps the buyer, say by chance another, client, they're offering the same amount and you're like, well, how do we win and make our offer stronger? You might increase that EMD, or you might have, one EMD now, one later if the buyer is selling a property, but there's strategies where you can use this to help the buyer in a competitive situation. All right. Now, with that being said, the EMD release, let's talk about that. Releasing the EMD strategically after a contingency has expired, meaning that if, say by chance, you're doing more than one EMD, once this contingency expires, then if the buyer, say by chance, they're offering a $15,000 EMD, I offer $5,000 up front. And then once I've gotten through all those other contingencies, the other $10,000 will be paid to satisfy that full $15,000 EMD, right? So it looks to the seller on paper like, okay, this buyer's offering $15,000 and they are, but it's strategically done so that it's protecting the buyer and being put on the table after those things that are of utmost important to the buyer are satisfied. Okay. And it also, we know it strengthens the buyer's credibility, but let's talk about what happens if a deal falls through and the buyer is talking, as it pertains to releases of earnest money deposit, because this is something that I want to make sure that all of our realty pros understand well, right? In a contract, when you are releasing a contract and releasing an earnest money deposit, what has to happen? Somebody take yourself off mute. Well, you know what? Let me clarify that first question. You have a contract and you have an EMD. Does that require one release or does it require two releases?
Two releases. The buyer releases and the seller agrees to it.
Yes, so it requires two releases because there's one release that's a release of the contract. And the buyer can release the contract mutually if the terms are mutually agreed upon, or if it's a specific contingency that gives the buyer the ability to unilaterally release it because maybe the seller defaulted or maybe the seller did not agree to the inspection contingencies and they just didn't have a meeting of the minds and they do a unilateral release of the contract, then that is the release of the contract. The release of the EMD is different. The release of the EMD requires the seller to sign off on the EMD release in order to have that EMD released back to the buyer. Okay. One can be done unilaterally, the other one requires the signature of both parties. Okay. Now, with that being said, one of the ways around that is when your buyer, if by chance it doesn't work on one property, the buyer still has their EMD and escrow, as long as it's with the brokerage, then we can protect it there. It doesn't hinder the buyer in any way. It actually is a benefit because now the buyer can move on to the next property and they already have monies in escrow. So that when they move on to purchase the other property, their escrow, their EMD is already with the brokerage and they utilize that same EMD for the next property. Okay. And when they do that and they go to closing, then we'll be able to apply that EMD to the next property and they won't have to go through all of the sometimes inconvenience that it can cost to have a seller to be amenable to signing off on something if you have a seller who is contesting it. Okay. No, I say that because if we're working with buyers and the buyer is, as long as they are satisfied with your service and they're continuing to work with you, then it is good to have their EMD in escrow. Somebody unmute yourself and tell me, why do you think it would be a benefit to your working relationship with a buyer if they have an EMD in escrow?
They are trusting the brokerage that they're handling the money and they don't have to pay it a second time. So they're allowing you to hold on to it, and it gains interest too during the period.
So trusting the brokerage to hold on to the money, definitely. So we actually can't accrue interest on it. So in the brokerage, we have to have a non-interest bearing account.
That's
But
right. That's right. Okay.
in other accounts, it is interest bearing, but at the brokerage, it's not interest bearing. But yes and yes to the first part of that. Anybody else have any other thoughts? Well, let me ask you this question. I'm going to put it in this way, and I think this is going to be our last slide. Remember, we talked about with the seller keeping the carrot before the horse when we were talking about the deposit and them doing what they need to do in order to get to the closing and, finalizing everything that is needed. Was it most beneficial for that buyer to have a deposit in escrow or for there to be no deposit in escrow? And we talked about something that motivates them to continue the process and checking those things off. Well, in the same way, when a buyer already has skin in the game or when they already have monies in escrow, it's that same type of motivation for the buyer to complete that process. If they're working with you, they're like, okay, Aurelia, well, I'm working with Aurelia. That is one of the things that continues to keep them motivated towards purchasing the home that they hired you to help them purchase. Okay. When a buyer starts, severing ties and, terminating transactions and getting all deposits back, many times that buyer is on their way out the door. And you've put in a whole lot of work and they hired you to help them to get them across the threshold of their new home. So if by chance something happens with one transaction, well, guess what? We move on to another transaction and we keep moving forward because the goal is have them to be a successful home buyer and get them to settlement. And making sure that they remain committed to the process is one of the benefits of them allowing their EMD to remain in escrow until settlement because it's untouched until settlement. And when they get there, it comes off their closing costs, it comes off their down payment, it's there, and they got to settlement because they did not quit on the process. All right. So there are a couple more slides, but I'm going to actually stop there for now, and we'll have to pick this back up again, guys, but we're at 131. If you got something out of today's training, let me see you give some type of reaction or put a 1 in the chat. I want to make sure that this is something that was of benefit to you. Absolutely. Absolutely. I see you guys. I see you. I see you. Wonderful. If you have any questions or any final takeaways from the content that we were able to cover today, then take yourself off of mute. I'll give you guys a few moments to maybe make any final contributions or ask any clarification questions that you need before we end for the day. And don't go, because we have a couple of announcements before we end. All right, then let me ask you this. I want to vote. If you guys want to move on to another buyer negotiation training, because today was supposed to end, but we didn't get through all of our slides. We still have quite a number of slides, and we still have some of the addenda to make sure that you guys know how to utilize those strategically. If you would like to continue this series and you say this is a benefit, I need to make sure that I am skilled at doing this, let me see you put a 1 in the chat. If you say, okay, well, you know what, this was good for me, I'm finished with this, let me see you put a 2 in the chat. But I want everybody to respond, either 1 or 2. If you need to continue with this, 1. If you're satisfied with what we've covered so far, put a 2. I see a couple people putting their 1s in the chat. I see a few people. I want to get a consensus from everybody on the line, so drop it in the chat to let me know where you are.
We are ones.
All right. All right. It looks like for now, the 1s have it, because we definitely have some more content to cover. All right, so let me make a couple of brief announcements. So this evening is our Realty Pro Roundtable, guys, as we are closing out Realty Talks. Our Realty Pro Roundtable is this evening. I sent out an announcement video. Take a look at that video. It's in your WhatsApp group chat, but some very exciting, very important things that are going on at Porterhouse. I want to make sure that you guys are able to take advantage of these opportunities for you to earn extra income. Okay. And obviously, Mrs. Porter revealed to you before, we're watching, we're trying to see who are the diligent few, or who are those diligent ones. And we are looking for you to offer these opportunities to. Okay. Everybody has a chance to get those same opportunities. It is up to your participation. Are you participating? Are you showing up? Are you looking for those additional earning opportunities? If so, they are available, and we want to bring you together and tell you what they are. So we're looking forward to just unfolding those tonight on our Realty Pro Roundtable, and that's going to be virtual. Somebody type in the chat virtual for our Realty Pro Roundtable. It's not going to be in person. You get to stay in your, in your pajamas if you're at home, or if you're in a park or something like that. You can pop into the meeting. It'll still be daylight by the time the meeting ends. It's only from 7 until 8. Okay, but that is our 4th Thursday of the month, our Realty Pro Roundtable. There are some exciting and important topics that we want to make sure that we hear from you concerning. All right. So with that being said, Miss Pat, if you have anything that you want to offer, you can go ahead and offer those. Otherwise, as one last reminder, if you guys check the WhatsApp group chat today, we've initiated the Speed to Lead initiative. So we're sending out leads, as we have been sending out leads on a consistent basis. But now what we're doing to make sure that we're being good stewards over the leads that we're receiving is we're checking in to see who's available at the moment that the lead needs help. Right? We're dropping a message in there to say, hey, who's available for this lead? 50-50 split. The first person to respond gets the lead. Okay. So everybody has the opportunity to get these leads. It's just based on your speed to the lead, because we need our Realty Pros to follow up with people right away. Okay. And if by chance you say, okay, that was not a right number, keep moving and follow up with the next lead. Okay. Follow up with them. When you get one that is a good number, a good email address, you follow up with them until you convert them. All right. So it's with that, Realty Pros, that I want to end our Porterhouse Realty Talks for the day. Mr. Porter, if you would go ahead and stop that recording, I will turn the floor over to you, Ms. Pat. Not sure if you had anything that you wanted to provide or any of our Realty Pros that had any last minute comments. Thank you guys so much for your time today.
I just want to make, I guess, a couple last minute comments. First of all, I just want to thank you, Realty Pros, for our successful virtual home buyers expo on the 20th. Thank you all for everything that you do. You all are the greatest. We could not have done this without you. Want to remind you, please make sure that you contact the folks that you invite